Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from Chemknits, and today I have a really helpful dye project planned. At least I think it'll be pretty helpful. Today I am going to provide an example of how you can use mini skeins to help you develop a colorway. You can play around with your depths of shade on your mini skeins to determine the color you want before you go and dye a larger quantity. Say you want to dye a sweater. Start off testing the color that you want on minis before doing the full skeins, and that in the end can save you yarn in the long run. Today's video is sponsored by dyer extraordinaire Alanna Wilcox. Alanna recently created a workshop on how to create a digital dye notebook. And this is something that can be really beneficial to someone who maybe stores everything in paper or in YouTube videos and wants to be able to start replicating colorways they've done before with precision without having to redo the calculations over and over or search through many notebooks to find where maybe you jotted it down. This workshop utilizes Google Docs, which anyone can create a free Google account and then have access to it. And so it's a great way to create something that not only is useful in digital, but it can be available to you on any platform, your computer, your phone, your tablet, whatever you might be using. The lesson has 5 videos from 4 different steps, and you get at the end the template that Alanna is creating through her examples. This workshop is especially useful if you are completely unfamiliar with spreadsheets in general and specifically Google Docs, because she really does take the time to show things that might seem like tiny formatting things, but can make a big difference on the organization and creating a template that you want to use over and over again. Lesson 1 will take you through setting up your dye notebook, how to use Google Drive, and how to make the spreadsheets, add different pages, and things like that. Lesson 2 will take you through setting up an inventory page. Now, my inventory is hash marks on a catalog. It is not very well organized, and I know that I am excited to implement this inventory system myself, especially because I can include things like the date that I purchased dyes, in addition to entering the hex code of the color so I can color code it label based on the color swatches that these dyers have on their website. I think that is so brilliant, and I'm excited to implement this myself. Step 3 provides examples on how to create a template for your dye recipes and formulas. Now, this workshop isn't a learn to dye workshop, so there is an assumption that you come into this with some knowledge of dyeing yarn. And it's worth noting that different dyers approach their calculations and might choose to adopt slightly different terminology. And so it did take me a minute to realize that when Alanna was talking about mixing a color at 100%, that was talking about a 1% depth of shade or 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of fiber. I actually like Alanna's way of thinking about it, but since I talk about things in terms of the DOS, and so I'll think about colors in terms of 1%, 4%, 1/4%, and things like that, it just took me a minute to get into her brain space with these formulas. But I greatly appreciate the step-by-step process of not only how she was doing the calculations, but how she was importing the formulas into the spreadsheet. And I think that that can be really useful to someone. The final lesson is probably my favorite. It's about creating a project page. And the thing that I think is especially brilliant is that Alanna has these suggestions on how to make a record of a hand-painted colorway and the sizes of the colors are and how to record that in the spreadsheet, plus linking your project page to your different recipes that you've mixed. And so it's just a way to cross-reference your information that is a really, really beautiful design, and I think can make this digital dye notebook something that an indie dyer with a business would go back to. It's just a wonderful, wonderful setup. So, in conclusion for this mini review, I think that this is a really well thought out tutorial. The only thing I think is missing is a little definition of terms for someone who might not be as familiar with it. I think that if your goal is to create reproducible colorways and you want to do small things and scale them up, like we'll be doing in this video, I think that having this kind of system will be really, really helpful for you in the long run. And there are really a lot of benefits like that. I appreciate the time that Alanna put in to go through things and actually show as you make it versus rush through things. There's not like magic hand waving behind the scenes. She actually does show how she goes through and puts all these numbers into the spreadsheet. And so that is so helpful, I think, for someone who might want to take this approach and replicate it for themselves. If you're interested in signing up and purchasing this workshop, you can find all of the details in the video description at alannawilcox.com. Now, the yarn I'm going to use today are some mini skeins of platinum stock from Wool to Die For, and then I also have some 100 gram skeins of this base. If you are using a yarn that doesn't come in mini skeins, then if you have a scale on hand, you can wind the minis from that. But the minis that we will be using today are 20 grams. But you could do this with 10 gram, 5 gram. Having a more even number will help with your scalability, but it's something that I think anyone can do to play with. When preparing to do work with dry dye powder, I will be wearing safety glasses, a respirator, and gloves. Today I want to explore 3 different levels of saturation of a pink color that I mixed by combining 2 different colors of Dharma acid dyes. Now, it's really easy to calculate this so that way we could vary the proportions and make 2 stocks and mix it until we get the right level and combination of colors that we want. But I'm simplifying things today and really just having it be about the total amount of dye in each scenario. Therefore, I am going to make a 500 milliliter dye stock of a 95-5 mixture of Dharma Deep Magenta and Dharma Saphire Blue. I measured out 0.25 grams of the blue, measured out 4.75 grams of the magenta, and then dissolved this in water and brought the total volume to 500 milliliters. This is a 1% stock solution because there is 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of water. It's just a combination of 2 different colors. There's 5 grams of dye total in our mixture. Believe it or not, even to me, this is a slightly strange way to do things and to think about it, but the point is that if you keep track of the proportions and then the volumes that you're using, you can create something that you can replicate later on. Now, I will be clear, I'm planning to use the same stock that we're creating for our scale up. But with the records, you can then go and just calculate how much you need, either starting with dry powder or the mixture stock solution, or if you had 2 individual stock solutions. Let me know if it would be handy for me to break down the math of this a little bit more. Today, the goal is more about the fact that you can separate things and dye a color on mini skeins and then use that information to scale it up to get the color for, say, a sweater's worth of yarn or something like that. I'm not trying to make it overly complicated, but right now, as I'm filming, it feels like it might seem a little complicated. For some more explanation about the math and how I calculate different figures, I recommend going and looking at Dyepot Weekly number 117, the math of yarn dyeing. In that video, I go into depth of shade, on weight of goods, and how you can calculate for a 1% stock solution, and use all those numbers to calculate how much of your dye you need to get a particular depth of shade on your yarn. I set up 5 16-ounce jars to use for each of the colors. I wanted to add a total of 80 milliliters of dye to each of them. Starting with our 4% DOS, I would be adding 80 milliliters of the dye stock, then 40 milliliters of the dye stock, 20, 10, and then 5 milliliters of the dye stock. And then I would be adding water as needed to keep the total volume consistent. So no additional water to the 4%, 40 milliliters to the 2%, 60 milliliters, 70 milliliters, and then 75 milliliters. For actually measuring the dye, since these volumes are on the smaller side, I'm going to be using syringes that have the measurement markings on them. You want to use a syringe that is as close to the volume of dye you want to move as possible. So for example, if I'm measuring out 5 milliliters of dye, I don't want to use a 60 milliliter syringe. I should use a 5 or a 10 milliliter syringe. Similarly, if I want to measure out 20 milliliters, I should use a larger syringe, but ideally you want to measure once versus measuring multiple times if your goal is consistency, because that reduces the error. The scale up situation here is not perfect since we're going to be doing in jars and then going into a kettle later. But since in general I like to start with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar and 8 cups of water for my kettle dyeing, I mixed up a stock of 1 tablespoon of white vinegar and 4 cups of water, and then I added 1 cup of this volume of this vinegar mixture to each of the jars, remixing the stock as needed. I pre-soaked the yarn for over 30 minutes in plain tap water with no vinegar. And now I'm going to start adding this yarn to each of the jars, placing it in and then moving it around so the dye can access all of our yarn. And when I'm using the same spoon in multiple jars, I make sure to start at the one with the lowest amount of concentration and work my way up. If I were to dip the spoon into the darkest color first, then I could alter the color from one of the lower concentration colors. At this point, I'm now going to add another 1/3 of a cup of water. This is our water plus vinegar to each of the jars, just to increase the volume in here a little bit more. When I'm doing tiny jars like this, I like to wait until the end, but we're not really changing the concentration of vinegar since we've been adding that same concentration from our stock all the way through. And then once again, I can kind of stir up each of the jars to give our color a chance to access as much of the dye as we can. We will get tonals, and even though this is a test, there will be more, the yarn definitely has less room to move around in these jars than it would in the big pot. But you can see how if we wanted this more bright pink, that if we went for our 1%, which is this one in the middle, that might be more pigmented than what we really want. Certainly the 4% is ultra pigmented. This is sort of like a burgundy, a raspberry-ish burgundy color. So now we just need to set the color. If you've been watching ChemKnits tutorials videos for a while, you know how much I love my steamer basket. It fits these 5 jars perfectly. I do have links to all the materials and equipment I like to use in the video description. Now I have the jars inside my steamer basket with the water level just below the water level in the surface of the jars. And we just started heating it. If the boiling gets too high, I will reduce the heat. But I think I'm going to heat this for 40 minutes and then we'll come and check back in. If you don't know a good starting point for a color that you want, when you're playing with acid dyes, look at the manufacturer's website. They do have a recommendation for the amount of dye that you need to achieve the color that they're advertising. So if it's a more pale pink, you'll need less dye. If it's a saturated color like navy, you'll need more. But gram per gram, that pale pink will be less pigmented than the gram of the deep navy dye. So there's a little bit of a learning curve in there as you play with your colors and get used to the depths of saturation that you can achieve with different amounts of dye. A lot of times in my videos I sort of dye by feel, and I'm not super particular about the final depth of the color. But you can bet that if I'm dyeing yarn for a sweater or something that is a significant project with a significant amount of yarn and time that I'm going to be putting into it, that I will be testing things on minis in advance to figure out the relative levels that I want. It's been 40 minutes and there has been some up and down of the temperature in here in that time. Now, the palest color is pretty well cleared, but the deepest, let's see, let's just lift the yarn up. There's some color in there, but most of it is in the yarn. What I'm going to go ahead and do is add another tablespoon of white vinegar to each of the jars, even the paler ones. More vinegar certainly is not going to part. Let's just check the second deepest and sort of remove that mini. Well, that actually looks pretty well cleared. Let's see our deepest now. That is so close. I think what I'm gonna do is actually remove the steamer basket from the pot. That way we can use the pot and set this aside to cool slowly. So that way there's still going to be heat in the jars and we can probably absorb that last bit of color. The nice thing about the steamer basket though is I can lift this up and drain out that water and then set this aside. And I can even pop the lid back on to trap some of that heat in there a little bit more if you want. So here are the 0.25, 0.5, 1%, 2%, and 4% depths of shade. And right now, looking at these different depths of shade, I think that the 0.5% is the one that I want to replicate. This is a beautiful jewel rose pink that isn't too bright. I think the blue helped tone it back a hair. Just a hair. Made things a little bit more berry. Maybe. Ideally, I would let all of these minis dry so that way I could see the actual color before deciding and going on with the rest of the project. For the sake of this video, I picked my color while the minis were still wet. I'm not dyeing a sweater's worth today. This is more of a concept of how you can develop a color that you want and then go and scale it up. You don't just have to jump in and dye 6 skeins all at once. Now, there are definitely times when I will go and develop a colorway on 6 skeins, on multiple skeins, but I'm also filming these videos and I enjoy the, if we do this, what will we get? I'm not always going for reproducibility unless I'm trying to create 10, 20 skeins of one color, which I do occasionally. This is something you could definitely do in this spreadsheet as well. But the color I want is the 0.5% DOS. In this first one, I used 10 milliliters of dye for our 20 gram mini. To scale it up to 100 grams, I will want 5 times this, so I'm going to want 50 milliliters of the 1% dye stock. The math here from 20 grams to 100 is pretty simple, and I was able to just do that in my head. But having things set up and having your formulas set up in a spreadsheet so then you can go through and manipulate the weight of goods and play around with that is really useful. Plus, it lets you double check your math, so if I wanted to dye 6 skeins or 10 skeins, I would be able to do that. Plus, if I didn't have the stock already made because I was dyeing on the same day, I could break this down further and go up to the other calculations and look at everything up here. And so I could increase the weight of goods and look at how many grams of dye I needed of each of the 2 colors. So that way I could just measure out the dye directly for the project and not deal with having leftovers. In my dedicated dye pot, I have 8 cups of cool tap water, and I'm going to add 50 milliliters of our dye stock. And this time we've got enough water that I can rinse out my graduated cylinder a little bit, and we'll just go ahead and stir everything up. I'm mixing up the order a little bit because we've got more yarn and I do want the color to be even. I did squeeze out most of the water from our pre-soak, and now I'm adding it to our vinegarless dye bath and moving it around so that way we can help that color, that pink color, penetrate through the yarn. I know that with my tap water, colors can start striking fairly quickly, and so this is my preference when I want to do more of a semi-solid and tonal. If I want more variation, then I will add the vinegar first. But now I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. Use the weight of the skein to sort of stir things up a little bit. And we will turn on the heat to start heating things up. Once again, the yarn and the colorway we're going to get here could be a little bit more tonal, a little bit less tonal. That level is something that you can play around with more. You definitely can work on your minis and actually calculate the proportion of the volume of water for your tests and play with that more as well. So that way things can be as compressed, but there will be those small differences when you're dealing with minis in jars versus a full skein in a pot. So I want to make sure that you guys can keep that in mind as well. But as for the hue, that depth of shade that we're going to get from these tests, that is something that should translate well. There are some perks here. I am using the same dye stock that I mixed today to do this. So that is going to bring a level of consistency to the project. Unless my stock wasn't well mixed and something settled to the bottom. So there are chances that it won't be perfect if I made some mistakes along the way. I think the most accurate way to achieve the same amount of color would be to re-measure out, re-weigh out your dye powders each time. That is the best way to achieve a consistency from batch to batch. But even so, some dye brands can have some variation between the dry powder in batch to batch. So that is something else to consider when you are doing this. There are some brands that dyers consider to have more consistency with batches. I think that some say Dharma doesn't always have the most consistency, but I still really like the Dharma acid dyes. So these are all some other factors to keep in mind. But if you're keeping track of your notes and the dates, and you even have registered the date that you bought your jar, so then those are all things that can help you keep track of your colorway. And so if something doesn't turn out quite right, maybe it is because it's a different jar. So that is something that you can consider as you are troubleshooting. After 15 minutes, our dye bath has cleared. I'm going to turn off the heat and let things cool off in here a little bit so then we can go and wash the yarn. We're actually going to wash all of the yarn together at the same time, but I think I will wait for that final comparison once everything is dry. We'll take a look and see how well we did. As I take these minis out of our jars, I am going to pop them onto a zip tie just so that way I can keep things organized and help prevent tangles. And you can also see that the water is clear in all of the jars because all of the dye is in our yarn. As I said, we're going to wash everything at the same time, but I think that things worked pretty well. I mean, again, I'm not going and putting the skeins in order and pulling it out just to check, but I think that the colors ended up good. I just added some dish soap. We are washing with cool tap water, and there is no bleeding. So I will go ahead and rinse out all of the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and then hang everything up to dry so we can come back and have some conclusions. We created 5 different pink shades using variations of proportions. Of our 95-5 mixture, we had a 4% DOS, 2%, 1%, 0.5%, and 1/4%. Then from these colors, we picked one, and we picked the 0.5%, the second palest pink, to replicate on a full skein. This is just an example to show how you can work to figure out the colors that you like on mini skeins before scaling it up. Yes, we only scaled up to 100 grams today, but you could use this to scale your project up to 500 grams, 1,000 grams of yarn, whatever you need. Some dyers might like to create swatch cards. So for example, with this mixture, you could wind these around a little card with the date and the recipe. And if you set up your digital dye notebook, you could cross-reference that with your recipe, so that way you could look at the colors under different lights and go back and try to recreate those recipes. I actually think that a digital dye notebook will complement physical samples that you might keep on hand really, really well. It means that you can focus on the organization of the yarn samples and not worry about having the space to write the recipes in there because you can cross-reference your digital notebook. As for the color, I think there's no question that we nailed the same shade in our 100 gram skein as we did in the minis. One other thing worth noting, which I mentioned previously, is that the tonal variation here is different in our full skein versus the mini that we were matching. That comes from just the difference in our surface area, the different volumes that we were dealing with, and things like that. But we matched this tone perfectly, especially once we go and look at the entire set as a whole. Today we started with one proportion of colors and varied the level of saturation. We varied that depth of shade. But you could do this with combining, looking at different depths of shade while also changing the proportions of colors that you mix. So you can start with 2 dye stocks and then measure in different proportions to see which mixture and which hue you like the best. But if you're consistent and are starting with mini skeins where you know the weight of the mini skeins, then you can scale up these proportions that you're mixing. It's just keep accurate notes and that'll help you scale something up. Once again, I would like to thank Alanna Wilcox for sponsoring today's video. You really should go and check out the tutorial on how to create a digital dye notebook. I think that that organization can really help, especially if you do want to make sure you can maintain consistency. If you have a colorway that you dye to order, for example, or if you want to be able to reproduce something over and over. This reminds me a lot of the ways that I set up my lab notebook way back in the day when I was working on my PhD, but moving this method towards your dyeing. I mean, not everyone films all the yarn they dye, so not everyone could go back and look at exactly how they set it up and re-watch it over and over again. So coming up with a consistent method to record everything that you're doing if you want to go back and switch up your technique, switch up your colors, it is helpful. And I think that it's really easy to adapt Alanna's program for something that will work for you. So thank you, Alanna, for sponsoring this video. You can find links to Alanna Wilcox's website in the video description. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, ring that bell so you never miss a new video. I always publish new videos on Tuesday and Friday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, but we also have unboxings and other special series along the way, and why would you want to miss any of it? If you'd like to help support the content that you see here on Another Level, I do have a Patreon and Etsy shop. Details for all of that are all in the video description. I always include a lot of information in my video descriptions, so it is worth checking out if you have questions about yarn bases or other things like that. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.